je suis très contente de vous voir tous ici, tout le monde si nombreux. La chaire d'histoire contemporaine est ravie de pouvoir accueillir ce soir, mais surtout demain, je parle d'abord de ça, un atelier de recherche, un workshop petit, certes, mais excellent, local, certes, mais transnational dans les thèmes traités, et en présentiel, et ça c'est ce qui est le plus important peut-être pour pas mal d'entre nous, mais connecté avec le monde de nouveau, avec WebEx ou Zoom, je ne sais pas si c'est un des deux. Et le titre de cet événement, Emma, c'est Revolution, Memory and Commemoration, Women's Activists in First World War and Post-War Period 1914 to 1921. En fait, c'est autour de la thèse de doctorat de Clotilde Fass, doctorante assistante, comme beaucoup d'entre vous savent, ici à la chaire d'histoire contemporaine. C'est donc autour de sa thèse que les activités de réseautage et de recherche sur les femmes et le genre pendant la Première Guerre mondiale se sont développées depuis pas trop longtemps ici à Neuchâtel, n'est-ce pas? Avec mon arrivée, cet intérêt pour l'histoire du genre a pris de l'élan, et puis depuis un moment, on s'occupe de cette histoire des femmes et du genre pendant la Première Guerre mondiale. Pas seulement de ça, mais aussi de ça. Cette année, pour la première fois, on a organisé un séminaire et beaucoup des étudiantes et étudiants qui sont ici font partie de ce séminaire bachelor du genre dans la guerre de 14-18. Donc, enseignement que je donne ensemble avec Clotilde Fass. Clotilde a très vite créé des échanges avec une équipe de recherche sur la question venant de l'Université de Leeds et de l'Université de Sheffield aussi, et particulièrement avec deux chercheuses spécialistes de la question qui sont Corinne Painter, lecturer in German and Intercultural Studies, et la professeure d'histoire Ingrid Sharp. C'est les deux qu'on accueille aujourd'hui. Je suis très contente que les deux se sont proposés à partager leur savoir déjà ce soir et pas seulement demain dans le workshop qui est plus clos, il y a plus d'experts, enfin c'est plus une question d'expertes. Et aujourd'hui, vous allez partager votre savoir et vos activités de recherche et vos activités didactiques aussi avec un public plus large, donc dont nos étudiants, mais aussi d'autres personnes qui sont venues nous joindre aujourd'hui. Donc un très grand merci, thank you a lot for coming here, and I hand over to Clotilde qui va les introduire de manière propre, et j'ai écrit ça en anglais et je me perds. I hand over to Clotilde qui va introduce them properly. This is my sentence.
Thank you very much, Christina. So first of all, I have a little list. Don't worry, it's not going to take long at all. And I'm going to speak English, even though with my accent, you are going to understand. It's not. So first of all, thank you very much for everyone to be here. I know I've talked a lot about it in the seminar and bothered you a lot with this. So I'm really happy that you were here, that you are here now, and that you are going to share this moment with us. And I want to reassure the ones that are not really fluent in English, that don't trust themselves to ask questions in English, that I'm here and you can ask it slowly in French and they are going to understand. And if there is a problem, I will translate everything without problem.
And you can talk German.
And you can talk also German. German is understood, no problem. So just a little thank you to Christina for supporting me and helping me in the organization of this day. And then, of course, very, very thank you to Ingrid Sharp and Corinne Painter, who made the difficult travel to Neuchâtel. So I'm going to introduce, first of all, Ingrid Sharp. Ingrid Sharp, who is a professor at Leeds and the of German cultural and German history at the University of Leeds in England. And she's especially interested in the history of women's movement and women's activists during the First World War, the Revolution, and the Republic of Weimar in Germany. She also worked on the representation of women during the unification time after the fall of the Wall of Berlin in 1989. And she made her PhD at the University of Leeds in gender, cultural representation, and the First World War. She has made a lot of projects that are about the revolution. I'm going to cite two of them. One of 1918 called Gender and the German Revolution, Writing Women into the History of the Kiel Uprising, November 1918, which led to exhibition in Kiel, if I remember well. And now in 2021, she has a fellowship in Graz in Austria called War, Welfare and Gender Politics in the First World War in Local and Global Dimensions. I'm not going to tell all the wonderful books that she wrote and that helped me a lot in my thesis and in the beginning of my thesis, but I want to tell you about some of them because I think they can be really, really helpful in your research. And so the first that I first present you, if you are with Christina and me and the seminar, is Aftermath of War, Women's Movement and the Female Activists from 2010 and 11. In 2017 she wrote Women Activists Between War and Peace, Europe 1918-1923. And in 2019 she edited a book called 40-80, so revisited, the War 40 to 80 revisited, and it was a book that tried to renew and achieved to renew all the approaches about the war. Finally, one of the last books I want to tell you about is the one of 2019 called Women's International Activism During the Interwar Period, which is also very, very important and helped me a lot. I'm going to now present also briefly Corinne Painter. Corinne Painter is a lecturer in German and intercultural studies. She studied for a PhD in Leeds and worked on the works of Hilda Kramer, which is a German Jewish writer and a campaigner in the women's movement. She is especially interested in the gender and in the First World War and the German Revolution. An angry baby. Okay. She specialized in resistance. He's resisting too. The German Jewish history and the history of women writing and life writing. And she coordinated in 2019 with the National Festival of Bristol an exhibition dedicated to the rediscovery of hidden or lesser-known history of the First World War. She wrote in 2019, Writing Lives, a Female German Jewish Perspective on the Early 20th Century. Finally, she wrote with Ingrid Painter a joint contribution to the history of women in the revolution, which is called Women of Action, Performance, Gender and the German Revolution of 1918, and it's been published in 2021. So now I'm going to leave you with these two very, very renowned historians, and I thank you very much to be here.
So firstly, let me just say thank you very much. Thank you for the lovely introductions. And also thank you for inviting us to come and speak to you. This is the first time that I've spoken to such a large audience since March 2020. So it is wonderful to see you all here. So thank you very much. I had to get up very early in the morning to arrive here today, so I'm quite tired, and I tend to talk a bit fast when I'm tired, so if I start going very, very quickly, just give me a wave and I can try and slow back down again. Okay, so let's get started. Right, so I'm going to give a brief overview of the origins of the German Revolution, and then I'll pass over to Ingrid, who will talk a bit more about the historiography. So to understand why the revolution happened in Germany, we need to look at the circumstances surrounding the First World War. So initially, at least in the press, there was an idea of a sense of war enthusiasm. Crowds gathered in town squares across Germany to show their support, and many young men enlisted in the army. However, there were also large peace demonstrations, and this enthusiasm was very, very short-lived. So, not quite yet. So the Allied economic blockade was very successful and quickly led to food shortages. Moreover, 1914 saw a poor harvest, which compounded this problem. Before the First World War, Germany had relied heavily on importing chemicals for fertilisers, which meant as the war dragged on, this situation of a lack of food was only going to get worse. The government's reaction was reactive, not proactive, meaning that any measures they introduced were very short-lived, they were poorly explained, poorly supported. Furthermore, road and rail were prioritised for military use, meaning that the food was left rotting in the fields and the depots, unable to reach the cities where it was needed. In addition to these domestic problems, there was also a sense of a lack of military progress, particularly on the Western Front, and we can all imagine the soldiers in the trenches there. So there was a real sense of stagnation, and we have to remember that the home front and the soldiers at the fighting front were able to communicate with one another. They were writing letters back and forth. So the soldiers who had signed up with great enthusiasm in 1914 were writing home to their families saying, we're really bored, we're really miserable, nothing is happening. And then the home front, their families were writing back to them saying, we're bored, we're miserable, we're starving. And it led to the sense of what on earth is the point of this? If Germany's not going to win the war, why should we put up with this? Why should we struggle and make our lives so difficult if Germany's not going to win? So the misery was most acute during what became known as the Turnip Winter of 1916-17. So this was, what we see in Germany here is a real slow decline in the quality and quantity of food. So it's not that people suddenly were starving and dropping dead in the street, but we start to see an increase in the mortality rate. So people start to die from diseases that we would have expected them to have recovered from before. Moreover, we also see the birth rate declining. This is both because men are away fighting, but also because when women don't get as much to eat, they become less fertile, so fewer babies are born. The babies that are being born are often malnourished, sickly, and are more likely to die. So for the people of Germany, they start to realise, well, there's no future for this. If we don't have any children being born, we don't have a nation. So again, why are we doing this? Why are we fighting? And so what we see is a very quick explosion in the revolution. Hopefully you can see from this map. So this has the dates in different colours of when the revolution began to spread. So it starts up in the north of Germany. Hopefully you can see Kiel up there on the right, where we have the townspeople coming out in support of the mutinying sailors. And it then sweeps across Germany and reaches Munich, right down in the south, by the 9th of November. So it's so quick. And then across east and west as well. And then this photo is one of my favourites, so hopefully you can see that one as well. So this is women standing in a queue for food, and you can kind of make out, if you look at this image closely, that there's women of all different classes being represented there. So we've got, wealthy women with very fine hats and coats, and then women with just shawls and no hat at all. And then just here is a policeman. And I think that really is quite interesting to show the mood on the street there, because why would a policeman be standing in this queue if there wasn't some kind of sense of potential threat or danger that these women are posing there? And this became a real important part for our research. So I'm going to hand over to Ingrid now.
Okay. Thanks, Corinne. Right, so I'm going to talk about how the revolution is being remembered and commemorated in Germany and why this is a problem. So German historians have asked a number of questions about the revolution. They've asked, was it a revolution at all? They've asked, was it a failure? Why was it a failure? And endlessly, did the SPD betray the revolution? So histories of the revolution do tend to see it as a failure because it didn't bring about lasting change. Above all, because the Weimar Republic itself didn't prevent the rise of the far right, and we all know what happened after that. And historian and journalist Wolfgang Nies, in his book of, I think, 2020, I haven't written it down, no, 2018, sorry, said that depending on your political standpoint, the revolution is seen in many contradictory ways, and hardly any of them are positive. And I've listed some of the things there that Nies identifies in his book. Only the very last one is positive at all, the birth of democracy on German soil. And with the approaching centenary, so around about 2018, this interpretation started to become the dominant interpretation. So the revolution started to be seen as the foundation and the cornerstone of German democracy. And women have largely been left out of revolutionary history in the existing scholarship. And this positions women as passive beneficiaries of the revolution and therefore passive beneficiaries of German democracy, if that's the way you're interpreting it. So there's been a lot of gender research into the Weimar Republic. Lots of aspects of the history of World War I have been looked at from a gender history perspective. But the German Revolution remained exclusively male until very, very recently. The Friedrich Ebert Foundation put together a list of 321 publications about the revolution, and only 21 of those were either by or about women. So I just included anything that had women either as the author or in the title. These are not feminist interpretations. They're just ones where women have some role, and that's 6.85%. And many scholars either entirely ignore or in fact explicitly deny the relevance of women's participation to an understanding of the revolution. Purely focusing on the revolution as an event in Kiel, which was sparked by an uprising by sailors, is overly restrictive. And from this perspective, the revolution becomes a momentary event that was rapidly repressed. So the revolution was only those days in which people were out on the streets, particularly those late October days where the sailors were the ones who took the lead. But if we want to talk about revolution as being the birth of democracy, we need to broaden our perspective, and we need to include the things that Corinne was talking about, which were those that revolutionary spark, the frustration and the restlessness and the activism of working class women that made it possible for a revolution to take place. Now, the centenary has prompted a lot more interest in the revolution. There have been a number of commemorative exhibitions, publications aimed at the general public, like the Wolfgang Nies book that I said. But here too, women have been largely put at the margins or overlooked. And here's an example from a recent exhibition in the Kiel Maritime Museum. They call it Die Stunde der Matrosen, the hour of the sailors. So that gives you an idea of the focus that they're going to take. It's a maritime city. It's still a naval city. So the focus on the sailors is reasonable. And you wouldn't expect women to play a central role, but they don't play any role at all. And even where women were in fact present, they've been written out of the story by careless labelling. And I hope I can show this now. Okay, so have a look at the label from that picture, that last picture. The label claims that these are deck and non-commissioned officers of the Navy, all right? And yet, if you do focus on the crowd, they're not all sailors, they're not all men. There are clearly women in the crowd, and they are not deckhands, and they are not naval officers, whether commissioned or non-commissioned. So excluding women in this way, even when they're actually there, robs them of their history of political activism. And this is bad anyway, but in the German context, I've said that the revolution is being explicitly positioned as the foundation stone of German democracy. So leaving women out of that story is particularly unwelcome. Now, there is another exhibition, this one, Revolution 1918, in Schleswig-Holstein. It visits schools and towns throughout Schleswig-Holstein, and it seeks specifically to connect present-day activism for democracy with the moral courage shown by the Kiel citizens of 1918. But when they were putting together this exhibition, choices were made again and again that could have included women, but did not. In other words, in the judgment of everyone putting the exhibition together, women played no part in the revolution and therefore no part in the democratic transformation of Germany. And I think you'll agree that there's something dramatic, something performative about revolution. We've internalized a script about how to do revolution, and this is visible in the revolutionary flash mob that I'm going to show you some pictures in a minute, that rolled through the railway stations in Germany in November 2018, following that very rapid path of the revolution. Now, if you were my students, I'd get you all to stand up and make a revolutionary pose, but I think you'll just be embarrassed. So I'll ask you to imagine one instead. Okay, imagine a revolutionary pose. What does revolution look like to you? Does it look a little bit like this, maybe? This is in Jena and in Weimar, men shouting. Raise fist, very important. The raised fist, plant the feet, a bit of shouting. That's revolution, isn't it? Or how about this? This is in Kassel, and that is where the archive of the women's movement has its place. So you do see that there are some women in the audience. They are watching the revolution. So are you beginning to notice a little bit of a pattern forming? So all of them are using similar iconography, a similar revolutionary stance. And this is a stance that excludes women. If this is what we see as revolution, men standing on the barricades, raising their fists and shouting, of course you're not going to find women there. Or you're only going to see the women who stand on barricades and also shout as revolutionaries. So including women in the story of the revolution is a choice. And if you have a look at this, in either the English or the German, Ariadne, which is the journal of that women's archive in Kassel, concluded a survey of the publications on the Weimar Republic makes clear it's still apparently perfectly possible to write the history of the first German democracy without considering women's equality. They were talking about suffrage there, but it applies just as well to the revolution. I'm now going to hand over to Corinne, who will tell you more about our project and our research.
So, thank you, Ingrid. So now you understand the challenge that we were facing. So we had a number of research questions that we wanted to investigate. So firstly, what were the possibilities for women's participation in the revolution and for shaping the post-revolutionary order? Who were the women and what roles did they play? To what extent have women's stories been carried over into historical accounts? And what changes in our understanding of the revolution if we include women in the story and take them seriously as revolutionaries? So we're not just saying that women were there, that they were watching, we're saying there were women who were revolutionaries. So there are a number of women who are quite well known from the revolution, and maybe some of these you've come across before. So we've got Rosa Luxemburg, probably the most famous, Clara Zetkin, and Toni Zender there. But what about the other women? Who else can we find when we look a little bit deeper? So we've got here, for example, Hilda Kramer. She was just 18 at the time of the revolution, but she took to the streets, she listened to revolutionary speeches, she joined the revolution full with passion. She describes people on the streets calling for the abdication of the local monarchic family and even the Kaiser himself. So this wasn't just a random protest, this was a revolution, and she was in the thick of it all. And we've got a lovely quotation from her here where she says that she decided to dedicate her life to socialism. So it wasn't just that this was one moment where she happened to be part of a revolutionary crowd. This was actually the beginning for her, where she made a decision that the rest of her life was going to be dedicated to this. And on the 7th of November in Munich, she describes that she marched in the twilight through Dachauer Strasse to the train station. And the closer we got to the Malteserbräu, which is a public meeting house and beer keller, the thicker the crowd grew. The train station and the telegram office were occupied by soldiers. My path led through the Turkenstrasse to where the barracks where, as someone explained, some officers had begun a resistance. Below the windows were many broken pieces of furniture and mattresses that the soldiers had thrown out. When I eventually got home, tired and hungry, I was convinced that the first act of the Bavarian Revolution was over. We didn't just have the workers on our side, we also had the soldiers. So it's this wonderful moment of unity where the workers and the soldiers have come together to overthrow the royal family. We also find Gertrude Folker, another young woman who was long involved in socialist activism. So in 1915 she joined the socialist youth movement and she lived in Kiel, so up in the north. She was involved in working with the SPD and the Secretariat and involved in the socialist women's movement. And I love this, that she says the workers were much more disruptive and lively than the soldiers. So it's not the men telling everyone else what to do. It was a real moment of unity there as well. We've got a lovely quotation from her as well, which I will not read out because it's a bit long. And for people like Folker, who'd been involved in active left-wing groups, the protests and the subsequent revolution were the culmination of years' worth of socialist agitation. So again, this wasn't just a moment where she thought, oh, there's something happening, I'm going to join in. This was something that she had dedicated so much of her life to and was excited to be a part of. And she describes her friends in the Socialist Workers' Youth Group marching through the streets, singing battle hymns and carrying flags. And also in Kiel, we find Martha Riedel, another young, very young woman. She's only 15. And she was another member of the Socialist Workers' Youth Group. And she actually was a messenger for the revolutionaries in Kiel, and then later became a local councillor. And she was a very, very young girl, but taking on the role of passing communications was vital. You know, without knowing where the opposition forces were, the revolution would have been crushed very quickly. And she was really risking her life. She describes the bullets flying as she's running through the streets of Kiel to let everyone know what's going on. So for all of these women, the revolution was an important part of their lives, but it was not a momentary event. All of them went on to have careers in politics and to continue the fight for social justice. Which then leads us to, well, why don't we know about these women? Why haven't you heard of Martha Riedel, for example? So we have women's activism being hidden by necessity during the war and revolution. So for Martha, who's running up and down on the streets, it's handy for her to say, I'm not a revolutionary, I'm just a young girl who happens to be out and about. So if anybody stops her, they're not suspicious, and then she can go and pass the message on. And we find this again and again, that women actually hide their revolutionary work so that they can continue it. So for example, we have women who hid deserters, for example, men who didn't want to fight. And they pretended that this was just their boyfriend and they were just looking after him, when actually they weren't in love at all, they were just helping hide him from the authorities. So if we just take them at face value, we're not going to see them as revolutionaries. We also have barriers to women's participation. In particular here, women were only allowed to participate in political meetings since 1908. So before 1908, you couldn't even attend a meeting where politics was being discussed as a woman. So it's only given you 10 years to gain revolutionary consciousness and to get involved in politics. We also see demobilisation practices that prioritise the soldiers over the women. So when the soldiers come back from the war, they are given a job, and the woman who had their job before is fired. So women start to be removed from public spaces. And it means that in the trade unions, these women who were holding positions are being pushed out. So it's much harder for them to then become involved in revolutionary organising. It also depends on the sources you use and how you use them. So if you only read the official council minutes, where only men were able to participate in the council, you're not going to find the women there. If you only read letters from soldiers talking about how excited they are about a revolution, you're not going to find any women. So you need to think big. Where else, what other sources can we look at? Where can we find these women's voices? One of the main sources we've used has been women's memoirs themselves. So women in their own words talking about what they did during the revolution.
Right, one of the best things that I have done in my academic career, apart from coming to Neuchâtel, of course, was getting involved with a socialist and socially very critical, very small budget theatre group, and working on them to create the play Women of Action. And this toured in England and in Germany in 2018. And Corinne and I went along with the play and had a great time. And sometimes we were allowed to introduce the play and give a little lecture and talk about it. So it's really fun to talk about this aspect today. So the play was based partly on Corinne's and my research and interpretation, but also on research that was done by the playwrights themselves. So we were working together to find these women and to see where the stories were. And I'm going to show you a film in a minute where the two, the producer and the playwright talk about it. And at one stage, Jude says, well, we thought we wouldn't have enough stories, but then we had too many stories, because Corinne found 256 women, all who were registered, and we could sort of prove that they were there, that they were revolutionaries, and we could have followed up some of the other stories, but this would have been dramatically not very good. So the play imagines a confrontation between this woman here. She's Joan Littlewood, a radical British theatre director, and she, as you can see, she was involved in the Theatre of Action in Manchester, not far from Leeds, 1934. She put on a play by Ernst Toller, who is a German playwright, and it was the first UK production of Feuer aus den Kesseln, Draw the Fires, in Manchester in 1935. So Toller was an expressionist playwright who ended up leading a revolutionary army against counter-revolutionary forces in Munich. He was arrested in June 1919 and spent 5 years in prison, during which time he wrote his memoirs, he wrote a large number of plays, he wrote rather a beautiful book about swallows, which you may or may not know. And in 1935, he was in exile because Germany was now National Socialist, and of course he was on the list of enemies. And you can see from the image that he chose to be on the front of this edition, he saw himself as a revolutionary, and he was claiming the credibility of experience. Now his play, Draw the Fires, Feuer aus den Kesseln, is set in the boiler room of a naval vessel, of a ship, and it has a cast of 40 men and 4 women. And these women were in rather stereotypical roles. There's a barmaid, a mother, a sister, that kind of thing. And Littlewood challenges Toller's male-centred account and demands to know where the women are, asking him, who are you to say that women's wars don't count? And this is when the revolutionary women from the past start, it's a bit surreal, but it works, push themselves into the narrative. So they're having this big argument in 1935, and suddenly you get Gertrude Folker saying, excuse me, and you get Martha Riedel saying, well, what about me as well? And they push themselves into the narrative, moving from the edge of the stage right into the centre, and then they demand that their stories are told. So we chose 5 stories, Gertrude Folker and Martha Riedel from Kiel, 3 in Munich, and that included Hilda Kramer as well. So the women, contemporaneous testimony supported by archival material such as police files and court records. If women are causing trouble, they'll have been taken to court. The police will have been watching them, so that's another possible source of finding, uppity women. And it shows they played key roles in the revolution. They took risks, they faced arrest, they faced imprisonment, exile, even execution as a result. Now, Toller claimed that the aim of his play was to capture the truth of the epoch, but with dramatic license. Artistic truth must be in line with historical truth, but doesn't have to be identical in every detail. So this is a fair point. He does have, as a playwright rather than a historian, he can choose. But one of the details he always forgot to mention was all the women he ever worked with. And we used the play, we can't do anything about that, sadly dead, but we used the play to force him into dialogue with some of these women and to demonstrate that if you take only men's accounts as authoritative, then you will end up with a partial and incomplete historical understanding. Now, as we've heard, Hilda Kramer was absolutely at the centre of events in Munich. She was one of the few women who had a role in the Communist Party. She was a delegate to the meeting of the International Communists in December 1918. And she wasn't chosen because she happened to be there or making the tea. She was also arrested in January 19, and again in May 1919. She was tried for high treason, and she could well have been executed, as many of the people she worked closely with were. Okay, she remembers a close relationship with Toller, but he doesn't mention her at all. Now, the meeting of Ernst Toller and Joan Littlewood in Manchester gave the drama its core. The conflict between Toller and Joan, centring around extracts from his play, allowing the key concerns of the project to come through and dramatically challenge the erasure of women's voices. And I was really impressed because this very short speech, I've given you all of it on 2 slides, by Joan Littlewood in the play, captures and summarises all the arguments that I'm trying to make in quite long lectures and quite long articles with hundreds of footnotes and books, and and it gets it. It's there, It's so I think that it's worth quoting at least some of it. So Ernst Toller says a revolution needs a mass of ordinary people, and Joan Littlewood says and hunger and starvation, the sheer heartbreaking 4 years of pain is what drove it. And who cops at least half of that? Who bears the burden of at least half of that? We do, but because we weren't in the trenches, somehow we weren't there. We don't know. And shooting a gun is a revolutionary act, but nothing else counts. You read history books, we're not in them. Men have this really strange sight defect where they only see each other and we get blotted out. Or if you're there, is someone's wife. I say Gertrude and Martha weren't just 2 girls who ran errands or worked in the office. I say they represent the heartbeat of the revolution, and without them it wouldn't have happened. But all you see, Ernst, is the mother or the prostitute, which is no good to me because I'm neither. Now we have a short play that, right, okay, I can do this. We have a short play to show you where you can see a couple of extracts as well.
So thanks. Hopefully you enjoy getting a sense and a flavour of what the play was and what it did. So just a few final reflections from Ingrid and me about what we learnt from this process. And we've got here 2 quotations from people who saw the play. So the first one, the actors play their roles with such appealing energy that you can't help but sharing their outrage at being left out of the history of the revolution. And that was someone who saw the play in Kiel. So hopefully they'd been to the official Maritime Museum and seen the official exhibition that Ingrid showed earlier that left the women out. and then saw our play and felt the anger that these women wanted to have their stories told. And then someone else who also saw it said that the responses to this play have shown me the importance of engaging audiences at an emotional level and opened up new possibilities for sharing my research. So the fact that Ingrid and I can stand here and we can talk about the revolution and we can give you the details and we can tell you the facts and we can show you where the sources are so you can do your own research. But it's when you see it in that form in the play that it really hits you emotionally, that you understand why this matters. So, finally, what we learned. And this is both from the play and from the research as well. So the first thing we learned was about keeping a record. So often we find that women are just sort of mentioned in passing and you think, wait, who was she? What did she do? Tell me more. So to try and find a way of recording what you're doing. So if you're doing something which is exciting now in 2021, write it down. Find a way to store it. Find a way to share it. And as Rosa Luxemburg said, the most revolutionary thing you can do is to proclaim loudly what is happening. To claim the space. So to stand there and say, you know, this is my space. I am a revolutionary. I have a right to be here. You are going to hear what I say. And amplify each other's voices. So if you know someone who's doing something really cool, tell other people about it, right? Make each other louder. And also what we learned was about sharing and adapting strategies that work. So we learned from the women how they worked together, how they created their revolution, and can we then bring anything from that forward into today. It's also about measuring success in different ways and talking about what has been gained. So as Ingrid mentioned earlier, it's really easy to dismiss the revolution and say, well, it wasn't a proper revolution, nothing really changed, you know, well, Hitler came along later and undid everything anyway, so it doesn't matter. But actually, if we measure it in a different way, how can we talk about success in a way that includes everyone who was a part of this movement? And how can we talk about what they actually achieved without just dismissing and saying, well, nothing really happened? And we've also talked about taking inspiration from figures like Rosa Luxemburg or like some of the young women we've talked about today, and taking inspiration from each other. It's also about recognising difference, and this is where the idea of intersectionality comes in, that we're not all the same, but we do have everyone has something they can offer and we can work together. And that was something that really came across through the play as well, with working with Bent Architect to create this piece, that we all had very different skills, and yet together we were able to create something really amazing. And also give space for emotions. So as academics, we're often told you need to be objective, you need to take yourself out of the piece and look at it from afar. And it's about recognising that we never really do that. Nobody ever can fully take themselves out of something and objectively look at it. And we need to recognise that and include that in what we do. And then this final quote, I believe, is from Arthur Ashe.
Arthur Ashe, the black tennis player.
Yeah, who was a black tennis player. And he said, start where you are, use what you've got, do what you can.
Inspiring words from both Corinne and Arthur Ashe. Indeed. So, I mean, what I hope you've got from this is that the way we present history and who gets to be included, who is excluded, whose voices are heard, whose voices are marginalised, this is a choice. And it's a choice that we can all make, okay? And the way things are represented matter. Now, I'm back at Kiel again. They took this 1950s image of revolution, and if you have a look, there is a woman, and I've made it bigger for you so you can see. Now, what does that tell you of the women's role in the revolution? Have they got Martha Riedel running bravely through the hail of bullets and being heroic? Have they got Gertrude Folker, who is sort of working in the Gewerkschaftshaus, and without her, the demobilised soldiers wouldn't have anything to eat, there wouldn't be a record of them also playing. No, you've got this woman in a headscarf. Oh, a revolution's happening, oh my. So, I mean, nothing more than a frightened observer. And that's what they chose for that outside window. This is what you walk past if you're queuing, this is what you stand next to. It frames the exhibition in your head before you even get in there. And we feel that the women you've heard about today, and the many, many women who did take to the streets, who risked their lives for a cause they believe in, deserve slightly better than that. And too often, the work that women do to make change in the world is depoliticised, overlooked, left out of the histories as unimportant. And in our work, what we want to do is restore these women to history as the political subjects and as the agents of change that they are. Okay, thank you so much for coming, so much for all your attention. We are very happy to take questions in English, et si vous parlez lentement, même en français.
Among sources that you found, what type did you find? Did you find writings, or you mentioned memoirs, but did you have other resources?
Yeah. So the memoirs were a really great resource which we used where we could find them, and it's interesting, you can buy these on Amazon, right? They're out there, you can find these memoirs. So we used a lot of those. We also used police reports, so where women were arrested you could find their police report or the court reports. Sometimes they had letters and details like that. I think that was the most ones we used.
Newspapers.
Oh yes, newspapers where there were reports of women involved in actions there as well.
And I think one of the surprising things was, because the women aren't there in the histories, we thought this would be almost impossible. But they were hiding in plain sight. It's just, if you're not looking for them, you're not going to find them. So, and there have been a couple of books written as well, and a dissertation was written, a very long and detailed dissertation, but in East Germany. So that hasn't been available, but it is now. You can consult that, and that has many names.
Yeah, so we've got a lot of names from that one. And there's been, Munich have done a little bit of research. There's a few people coming out of Munich, and I expect there'll be more and more coming out of there as well, where they started to talk about it, because that's one of the cities that were very excited to hear about the revolution, because it was a real positive moment in Munich's history before everybody and everything went kind of wrong.
And Matthew Stibber is working in some quite specialised archives of the working class and the working class movement as well, so he's found many more. He also found, in the GDR in East Germany, the state had collected memoirs of women who'd been active as socialists during that time, and of course when you read those they're told in a certain way, but it still gives some detail, and it still shows that there were women who were participating in the revolution, and that is part of the memoirs of some of them as well. So the sources are there.
Yeah.
They're not. It's not a huge amount, but they are there if you want to look for them.
Thank you.
I was wondering if, because of all your research you have led and are leading, has it changed? For example, at the Kiel Maritime Museum, has anything changed or not? Yeah.
Can I take that one? I could tell you a long story, but I will tell you a long story, but I'll try and make it short. Okay, I was invited to go to the Kiel Maritime Museum and to join in an academic workshop when they were planning this exhibition. And the woman who rang me up said, "We'd like to invite you, but we already have a woman." And I said, "Oh, you have one woman and one man?" And they said, "No, we have 10. Oh, I see what you mean. We do have 10 men, but they're all talking about different things. And you're talking about women." And I said, "Well, I think we can probably find a way of differentiating the revolutionary experience. Take a punt, invite 2 women and see what happens."
91?
No,
what was that?
That was in, I believe, that must have been 26, 2017.
Whoa.
I can't remember precisely. Okay, so they took a risk. They invited me, even though there was already a woman. I know! So, I was there. Kathleen Canning, who has written a lot about the revolution, was there as well. And Kathleen Canning theorised everything, and I spoke about women in Kiel, specifically in Kiel. And that was fine. And the director of the museum was very excited, and she said, "These women are all going to be in my exhibition." And she said, "You know, it's amazing. It took 2 scholars from America and from England to show us what we have on our own doorstep." But then later, as the exhibition developed, she said, "Well, we are a naval city, and it is mainly about the sailors. And unfortunately, we have to make choices, and certain things are left out." And then when I went to see the exhibition, she said, "I think you'll be pleased. There are some women in there." And I said, "Delighted." But when I went in and I saw where the women were, and where they were on the outside as well, I wasn't hugely impressed. You may have got that impression, that I wasn't hugely impressed that the women were not actually there as central to the story of the revolution. They were there because they lived in the city. They worked in the city, and there were pictures of women selling fish, and there were pictures of women voting for the first time, thanks to the revolution that they did nothing to bring about. There was no information about how women campaigned for decades in very difficult circumstances to win the right to vote. They were just there voting. So the women were there, but the way they were presented was as recipients, as beneficiaries of what the men had done. So the men are the subjects, the men are the agents, the women look on, frightened or otherwise, grateful, thankful, but they don't do anything. So, in short, sorry, that was a bit long. I have a lot I have trauma to relive here. In short, I made no difference whatsoever with my intervention, and we did take the play to Kiel, but it it wasn't, the director of the museum did not come and see it. There was one of the quotations was from someone who is part of the Socialist Party, and it's taken from a much longer post that he did on the party Facebook, which said, why? These are social democrats. These are socialist women. They are part of our history. Why does it take an English theatre group to come and show us our own history? So the same question asked again 2 years later. So basically, no, it didn't change anything.
On a more positive note.
Sorry.
I agree. I think in Germany, I think we've been knocking on the door and it's been kept firmly closed there. However, globally, I think we've had a lot of success about bringing the revolution and the revolutionary voices. For example, we're here to talk to you. But we've also, we went to South Africa and we spoke to some young South African activists who were doing a whole lot of training around how to be a modern activist, and they invited us to come and talk to them. And in the UK, people love this story. People get very excited to hear about the revolution there. So I think we've had quite a lot of success telling people there about it, but I think unfortunately Germany seems less interested in hearing from us about this particular.
But I think what I would say, I gave you those figures that only 6.85% of books written about this period are by or about women. And I think we need more research to be published to change the story. So I think, going in there with one paper and one play is not really going to change attitudes in Germany. I think there needs to be a lot more research. So maybe in another 50 years or 100 years, the story may include the women who were there. But thank you for that question.
Thank you.
it's not history yet, but last year, near here, there was first ZAD in Switzerland, and there was a lot of women and non-binary people involved and mediatized. So I would say that women are taking their place in the revolution, like in a mediatic space. And there's a new ZAD that began last week in Yverdon, so maybe you're aware of that. And there's the same team, so it's also a lot of women and non-binary people.
That's really great to hear. And yes, I mean, I think there are quite a lot of examples we can think of. I mean, Belarus is another one where there are lots of prominent women involved in activism there. One of the things I sort of thinking about it from the historical perspective is that quite often we find women starting these movements, as we saw with the women in the bread queues in 1915, getting very angry and demanding change, and then the men move in and it changes the story, and then the historians look back on it and say, oh, well, it was just the men. So I'd say, I love hearing these stories, and I'm very excited about, the future of where these kinds of movements might go. But we need to make sure when we tell them that we keep telling it and making sure people know who is there, whose idea was it, who's this group who started it all, and making sure that we always focus and make sure their voices are prominent. So that's a really lovely story, so thank you for sharing.
And make sure these stories make it into the archives, because another example where women have led, and I would say revolutionary change, is in Ireland with the referendum about reproductive rights, because abortion was illegal in Ireland for so many decades, and Irish women and girls who needed abortions had to travel to England, very expensive, very difficult to do. And it was the women who persuaded the entire population by going from house to house, talking to their uncles and their aunties and their mothers and their fathers and their sisters and their grannies and their brothers, etc., and persuading them. And when it came to the vote, there was this phenomenon of all the planes to Ireland. All the planes were full of women with overnight suitcases. They were going home to vote. Okay, now that story is amazing because it was successful. Abortion is now legal in the Republic of Ireland, but not in Northern Ireland. Go figure. So it's now legal. This was an achievement that was led by women. Because it was successful and because it was popular, the politicians, a lot of men, claimed that they were the ones who had had the idea. They were the progressives. And the thing is, if you look at any progressive piece of legislation, there are probably 20 or 30 years of pain, usually by women or the working classes or by marginalised groups like non-binary groups, trans groups, very marginalised, fighting to get heard, and then the history doesn't include them. They're there, but not really central, not like the Prime Minister. It was his enlightened idea to do this, not the women who had suffered and persuaded and worked and worked and worked to get this result. But nowadays, I think that the women are not just shutting up and letting this happen. They are pushing themselves into the archives. They are writing their own stories about the way it really was. So at least when, in 50 years' time, historians come to have a look at the referendum around reproductive rights in Ireland, there will be female voices providing a counter-narrative. So yes, it's really, really positive, but unless it gets written down, it could easily get lost.
So thank you very much. But so did you find some audiovisual sources after the revolution, after the Second World War, with women that were active in the revolution? No?
I mean, audiovisual material from then is not great. There's not a lot of material. You can find photographs.
Okay.
A lot of postcards seem to have been quite popular at the time. But again, they tend to be pictures of people on barricades rather than
But not
people.
testimonies?
Not as much. However, recently there was a film made, which I've completely forgotten the name of. A documentary filmmaker in Munich in the early 90s recorded testimony of people who were eyewitnesses to the revolution in Munich. Not necessarily all revolutionaries and not necessarily all women, because it was the 90s, you know, a lot of older people would have died by then, so she was mainly talking to people who'd been teenagers then, but she did get a lot of recordings of eyewitness testimony. And it's really interesting to see them talk about, well, my mother was doing this, my father was doing that, that's why I was then here. So you do get a kind of sense of what people were doing at the time. But I cannot remember the name of that.
No, I can't either.
No, but yes, so that was, they've done a re-edition of that recently, so you can find a DVD of that, or I think there's a YouTube version that you can buy to watch that. And it is really great, and it also is really great because it fits into my narrative that, you know, these people didn't just do one revolutionary thing and then go home. You can find, you know, they talk about their revolutionary resistance against the Nazis, or anti-war campaigning or anti-nuclear campaigning in the 50s, so you kind of have a trajectory there of kind of lifelong resistance. So it is really great, and I will have to try and see if I can come up with a title.
Thank you. The thing is that you know, some of the testimonies, they're framed by the assumptions of the people who are interviewing the women. So I mean, you can find the testimony, for example, of Martha Riedel. She was interviewed when she was 84, so no one was interested until that point. So her memories are, you know, they're good, but it's not the same as being asked, you know, even when she was 20, 30, 40, 50. And Gertrude Folker, she was interviewed a couple of times, but she appeared in a documentary film, and it was called War Opa Revolutionnaire, was granddad, very gendered, revolutionary. So the questions she was asked were never, what did you do, but what did you see the men do? So even where they're present, the framing makes it impossible for them to claim that identity for themselves. And you know, if you're saying, you know, well, I was important, and everyone else is saying, no, you weren't. You were a secretary. What did you do? You did nothing. You know, you just sort of, oh, okay, fine. So a lot of these women did not claim revolutionary identities for themselves. They just accepted, okay, I didn't do very much, really. You know, like the nurses after World War One. You know, well, I wasn't a soldier. Yes, I was at the battlefield. Yes, I was at the front. Yeah, I was shot at. Most of my friends were killed. Some of them died of typhus, but no, we were just nurses. You know, so it's the framing that is quite important, and that's why a sort of more feminist approach to history makes these stories visible in ways that mainstream history does not. Thank you for coming.
I have a question, which is, I mean, historians not so often work with fiction, and but more with facts. And this working with this theater people, how did this? Maybe did this change also something about how you would write history, or were you just those who gave the facts and then they did the rest, or did this change anything for you and your positioning as historians?
Well, I mean, there's a number of things to say there. One is that, you know, we were there to make sure that it was in line, like Ernst Toller, that historical truth was not bent. And we did have some big discussions about certain scenes and certain lines, and we said, no, this, you know, okay, maybe it happened, but we don't have any sources. You know, this is just a prejudice. We don't want to perpetuate prejudices here. And a lot of the lines that were incorporated into the play and made colloquial, you know, these are quite free translations, but they were things that the women themselves had said and that we had historical records of them. So, you know, I feel that there is historical truth at the core of this particular play, even though it's presented in a much more entertaining way than we could have done it. It's not an academic writing a play as if it were an illustrated lecture. It's a genuine drama. What would you say?
I mean, I'd say the way it's kind of changed my thinking is, I mean, as a historian, when you're reading materials in the archive, you're always thinking, what's the story here? How does this relate to the other things that I know? And trying to pull that together as you go. So it made me much more aware of that process of kind of creating a narrative from what you found. And something that really affected me when I saw the play, because both Ingrid and I saw the play loads and loads of times because we just loved it, so we went to loads of the productions. One of the things that really spoke to me was, you know, when you read the materials in the archive, I mean, I hope this is true for you and it's not just me saying this, I hear them speaking to me. You hear the voices coming out of the archive saying, this is my story, this is my story. And you think, okay, well, these people didn't know each other, but what might they have said to each other had they known each other? You know, you're trying to fit that together and you hear the voices coming out. But it's at the same time quite a lonely experience because it's just you on your own in the archive reading these materials. And you can go to the archivist and say, I just found this. But then, you know, they've got a job to do, so they're not quite as excited about the materials as you are. And so what was wonderful about the play was everyone in the audience could finally hear what I hear when I'm in the archive. And that was just so special. And something that I think you can only do through this process of collaboration with a theatre group, that you can have kind of what you heard brought to life for everyone else to hear as well. So I'd say that was another way that it really changed me.
And I think that that's a really important point because, you know, certainly at the university, and because we got money for this and to justify the funding, the explanation was our research is given to these dramatists and they learn from us and they do something with it. But what was not included is what would happen to us as a result of this process. So it was not, we researched, they playwrighted, and we went away saying, job well done. We collaborated, they researched, we made suggestions. I don't think we made many suggestions, but we were there, okay? And it certainly changed me as an academic, and it made me braver, it made me more willing to talk about the emotional impact. So, I mean, there's a lot of anger that can be involved if you are writing feminist history, because there's so much injustice. And of course, when you're writing, you have to remain you're supposed to remain very, very objective and not show your anger. But I don't see anything wrong with sharing with an audience or sharing, when I'm writing, the fact that it seriously annoys me, okay? So sometimes I'm angry, and, I think that we're more engaged as academics and as researchers than we were, or we're more willing to admit it.
Thank you. It's more a comment than a question, because I'm very near to your questioning. So I was wondering, the question of how women vanish from historical perspective, from memory. And I think there are two things. They vanish from memory, and you were speaking about that. I would say there's another point than the one you mentioned. I call this historiographical mimicry. It's in the sources, women are not presented, or they are not presented as being the important persons. And most historians, unless they are feminist historians or gender historians, they take this over. And I think this is historiographical mimicry. It's repeating the social order which is reflected in the sources. And I think this is really an important thing to correct when you work as a historian. This is one thing. But the other thing is the question, how do women disappear from in the social reality? I mean, taking Hilda Kramer. Now, she was very active in the Munich Soviet, and she had important roles. And then she became a communist, and she went in the Communist International. She was present at the Second Congress of the Communist International in 1920. But she was present not as a delegate, she was there as an interpreter. And if you look at the protocols of the Second Congress, she is not mentioned, she is not counted. And any woman who is only there as a stenographer, a secretary, or an interpreter, and these were mainly women, they are just not mentioned there. And I think, so once a revolution gets institutionalized, there is a strict, or more or less strict, division of roles. And women have these roles, secretary, courier, translator, and so, which are not considered political. And so they disappear from the sources. And the thing repeats, then historians, they think they're not important.
Yeah, exactly. And Hilda Kramer is a great example of that, because she talks about it in her own work, that she describes at one point she was at a meeting during the revolution in one of the beer halls, and she wanted to get up and speak. And she said as she was walking to the front to speak, her courage began to fail her, and she started to think, oh no, I'm a teenager. These are people who are so much older than me. What do I have to contribute as a young woman? And so she sat back down and didn't say anything. And she said that moment shaped her for the rest of her life, and she hated speaking in public after that. So she's not going to be on the list of public speakers because she's had that experience of just her confidence failing her. And you can also understand that, when people like Ernst Toller ignore her, well, of course she's not going to feel confident in herself as a revolutionary to put herself forward. So yes, you're absolutely right. That we do have this double system problem of the women themselves being put into roles that aren't recognised as revolutionary, and then the historians saying, well, they weren't revolutionary then, were they? Yes.
And this, I like the idea of this sort of historiographical mimicry. I think that works very well. And there are power hierarchies as well. I don't want to shock you, but there are hierarchies even in the academy, that there are some professors who you do not contradict if you are early in your career. And so when a professor, shall we not name him, says, when the revolution came, it was exclusively male, and says that again in 2018 and again in 2020, even though we just stood there and said, look at all these revolutionary women, there weren't any. You have to be quite secure either in yourself, like Corinne, or in your job, like me, to actually stand up and say, hang on a minute, Mr. Doctor, Herr Doctor, Doctor, Professor. It's really very difficult to challenge these people because of the power imbalance that is often there, and it's often gendered as well.
I hope that it will change on the next years, because, for example, here, like 3 or 4 years ago, we have not spoken about gender history or feminism or something like that. And I studied in Geneva for 1 year, and I did a work for Europe and the women, the construction of Europe, because they were not mentioned, and the same problem as said. So when you talk to the professor, he said, oh, yeah, they're not important. So why do you want to talk about her?
Yeah, this is an experience that many a PhD candidate has, and unless they're lucky to have a gender historian as their supervisor. I think that Veronika Helfert, who's just written an excellent book, Frauen wacht auf, which is about women in the Austrian Revolution, when she said this is the topic, they say, well, you won't have enough material. There won't be enough. It's not really a topic for a PhD. So 5 years, and it seems like thousands of pages later, there is so much material. It's just people aren't looking. So I agree with you. I hope it changes. and I hope that you will continue the change.
Yeah, so it's great that you raised it and said, hang on a minute. So keep doing that. I know it's scary and difficult.
She came back from Geneva to be here.
Yeah.
Because in Geneva she couldn't go
It was very difficult
Yeah.
to talk about that. And that was very, I have an argument with a professor, so that was very,
It's difficult, isn't it? Because the power imbalance is so great.
Yeah, and sometimes they tell you, but women are not very important there. But sorry, but we are the half of the humanity. So,
Yeah. So, I mean, a history that leaves out half of humanity is bad history. It's a distortion of the past. You cannot tell a true story of the past if you ignore all the feminist scholarship of the last 40 years and all the women who were agents and political agents of change in history. It just stands to reason. You can choose not to focus on them. You can write about histories of men and masculinities, but what you can't do is say this is the whole of history.
I think that your work is so important. And for example, the work of Clotilde is very important for the next generation. And for example, the work of the Professor Schultz is very important because we can see that women can be professors, and that women history or feminism history is like another history. How do you say? Niche en histoire, franchement. C'est une branche d'histoire à part entière.
It's a whole part.
I mean, this is what we say, that, you know, taking women seriously as revolutionaries and putting them in the centre of the history of the revolution doesn't just have the same history but with added women. It fundamentally changes our understanding of what revolution is. So asking these questions is really very, very important. I agree with you.
And to remember that, you know, we were once students ourselves. We were once at the beginning and had to learn things. So we can all do this, and we can all, you know, work together to try and create and keep pushing these stories in whatever methods we can, using whatever voices we can.
And I think that we, you know, as gender historians, whether we're men or women, we should reach out to each other, and we should also amplify each other's voices, you know, by sharing recommendations of what to read, of who to read. So to get beyond, you know, what is known as the canon, you know, the reading list that is white men, you know, create new reading lists. And, you know, in England we find academic Twitter is one way of doing that. Twitter can be horrible, but academic Twitter can be supportive, it can be affirming, and it can amplify voices that you otherwise wouldn't hear.
What we discover also in our seminary is that young men are more and more interested in that history, or in historicizing masculinity, which hasn't been historicized before because it was just like nature and they are just there. And so I'm rather optimistic right now, maybe because we have this wonderful seminary together, but I think things are slightly changing. But your experience from Kiel is so awful that I'm like, wow.
But I do think that there are national differences. But even in Germany, there are many amazing feminist scholars, or scholars of women's history, not necessarily feminists, and the same in Austria as well. So if we only look at the people who are at the top, you know, who are not as interested in centering women in history, then we can be quite depressed. But if we look at the research that's being done, and the research that's being discussed and read and shared, and the topics that students are choosing to write their essays on, I think we can be optimistic.
Well, it's just to react on that. I mean, it's the question is the glass half full, half empty, but we can see both. I mean, in France, for years and years, there was a total rejection of feminist or gender history. And suddenly there was a breakthrough. And I think Germany is a very tough country for that.
I'm not here.
Because it's a very professeure in Université, the German professor, who is a man and who has a lot of authority. And I think this is so strong, much stronger than in Switzerland, for instance. So I think it depends on different countries. But just to say, it's not an anecdote, I think it's significant. We had in Switzerland a whole year, nearly, of discussions about the 50 years, the only 50 years of women's vote. And there was a lot of public discussions. And now, the federal government has published a brochure about direct democracy in Switzerland, which they intend to distribute in the whole world over the embassies in 80,000 exemplaries. And in this, they speak about how Swiss democracy is so great. And then they have a half sentence about, yes, women, okay, and they say, this is the dilemma, this is one of the dilemmas of direct democracy. End of.
Oh, that was it.
That's it. So you think, hey, how can they do that in the same year when everybody speaks about, well, democracy, Swiss democracy was not a full democracy, it was a half democracy. And they just they don't listen. So I think, you know, it's something which has to go on, and discussions must go on. And well, it's your job now to do that.
Thank you.
Shall we finish about that?
Yeah.
That job they got this evening. And they can
You've all got your homework.
Yeah. So let us thank our two speakers about this wonderful evening you gave us. Thank you.
Thank you.